There's no reason to be engaging in violence in America at this point in order to bring about a political change. There are so many peaceful ways that we can pursue justice. Christians should be intimately involved in that. And I think we're not doing our duty if we ignore the necessity of being engaged in politics.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Narrative Podcast. Mike Andrews, Aaron Baird, David Mahan joining you on just a really slow
news week,
boring week at
week.
CCV. Nothing going on at all.
Exactly.
Not two major initiatives that we rolled out this week.
A big event this weekend.
Yeah, no events. Nothing else coming down the pipeline.
Something going on this weekend?
This is
Not
you don't do anything there. You literally sit in the back at the galas. At the galas, all David does is say 5 minutes, 5 minutes, and that's his only job.
Puts everybody to sleep while
Exactly.
he does it, and then it's going to be my job to
the
be there.
VIP.
I'm
the main attraction.
That's what
at the
people are
VIP.
there to see. Not Scott Jennings.
What's
it's
the
David Mahan. Oh my gosh, that's why the line for your photos are.
What's our coverage for mental health issues?
That is not included in our.
we got that?
Exactly.
Clearly not, because you are delusional, my friend. But the two things that we announced this week, we want to start with the Family Structure Index. This is the second year that we've put out this ranking of all 50 states. It's a measure of family health as indicated by the number of prime-aged adults that are married, the number of teens who grow up with a married mom and dad in the home, and then the total fertility rate. And then this year it's been adjusted a little bit so that it looks back to the year 2000. There's that baseline of 100 as the score from what the national average was in 2000. And then it ranks everybody based on where they are today. And Ohio, unfortunately, is still in the back half of the country at number 30.
Back to spot, yeah.
Yeah, but this has become such a great resource. And working with the Institute for Family Studies and Brad Wilcox's team, what they did this year to really strengthen this and make it something that's going to be such a valuable resource going forward is it's a strong piece. And David, I'm curious what jumped out to you, because I know you were really heavily involved with IFS when they were putting this together.
Yeah, this is our second run at it, and to be honest, it's sobering. We dropped back from 29 to 30th. There's some things in there that we obviously know that across the State House, across the street of the State House, everybody's telling us we need to kind of ease up on some of this family stuff so that we can not lose people. But, you look at the New Yorks in the index, you look at the Californias, the Illinois, those are the states that everybody's leaving to go to where there are states with strong families. Mm-hmm. And so we see that clearly. One of the most sobering thing is that there's not one state in the union that is producing enough children to replace itself. Mm-hmm. And that is really sobering. I mean, you need 2.1. Yep. And I think we have maybe one state that's even close. That even hits 2. So we got a lot of work to do. And again, we wouldn't have taken this on if it wasn't a monumental task. And this report just kind of lays that out for us.
Yeah. And Aaron, you got to write an op-ed with Brad Wilcox for the Daily Wire that talked about some other interesting trends that they uncovered as they put this report together. Talk about that.
Yeah, and I'll say I think we're gonna have Brad on here soon to talk.
Yeah, it should be next week.
Yeah, unpack this stuff.
So we don't want to give too much away right now.
Yeah, but I mean, there's so much in this both report and in this topic to uncover, and the Daily Wire piece. And David kind of alluded to this a little bit. What we really went after was the blue state exodus and the red state growth. And there's a lot of reasons for this, right? We don't want to do like what the left does a lot of times with their narratives and try to paint with too broad a brush of why folks are leaving some states and moving to others. But broadly speaking, you see blue states shrinking, California, New York, Illinois, those types of states shrinking, and you see what are known as red states growing. Idaho, Texas, Florida, those states in particular are doing really well. Those states tend to have higher ratings on the Family Structure Index. Is it only because they have strong family structure there that folks are moving to those states? No, but I think we can make a pretty clear case that family structure has a strong tie to why a state would grow. And what would that look like? Well, a few different things. Number one, the states that are growing tend to be those states that are more economically prosperous. And this is where your fiscal conservatives might say, see, it is about lower taxes and lower regulation. Well, hold on a second. Folks certainly want to go to businesses want to be in states that have low taxes, low regulation, makes it easier to operate, makes it easier to grow, to get capital, all of those types of things. But you have to ask the question, why is it that these states are able to have low taxes and lower regulation? It's not just because they have a smarter class of voter necessarily. It's in large part because they have less need for big government programs, right? And this is one of the things where family structure really matters. When families break down, government necessarily has to grow. Right, we talked about this especially last year with our family structure index. When kids are raised in homes without a married mom and dad, more likely to end up involved in violent crime, more likely to have worse educational outcomes, more likely to end up using drugs. All of the things that lead towards government growth, more likely to need government assistance for housing, for food, for healthcare, things like that. So you see the interconnectivity here. The other thing, though, that really was exciting for me in this report this year was certainly pre you, Mike, kind of right at the beginning of when David joined. Longtime CCV friends will remember an organization called Ohio Business Competes. And they partnered up with the Ohio Chamber and all of the LGBT groups back in 2017, 2018, to say Ohio has to pass a sexual orientation, gender identity bill in order for us to get folks to move here.
Equality Act.
The Equality Act, right? The Equality Act, Fairness Act, they had a bunch of different, puff names for it. And we knew it was bogus at the time, but like when you have the Chamber of Commerce saying this is for economic development, we have to do it, it carries weight. And it was touch and go there for a while. I mean, we know of serious efforts at the time to put that law into play. And what that law would do would require businesses allow boys and girls bathrooms, men and women's locker rooms, would require public schools allow boys to play in girls sports, all of those types of things. And so, we knew these were harmful things, but they were saying this was an economic bill. And actually what we see in the Family Structure Index is states that grow are states that actually care about families, care about kids, and aren't pushing crazy leftist ideology.
Yeah, and to your point about government having to grow, what that also does through taxation is it makes the middle class lifestyle pretty unaffordable in a lot of these states.
Yeah.
Like can you even raise a middle class family in California anymore because of how crazy their tax bills have become out there?
Well, and that'll be something fun to talk to Brad about, because you see Brad's really been digging in more and more on housing affordability and things like that. And again, I'm one on the housing affordability side. It's a little bit of a chicken and an egg type thing. That might not even be the right analogy for it, but I'm not so sure if we all of a sudden we produce a lot more houses, we're going to see a lot more marriage. But it does certainly make it more difficult for folks to make those advancing in life decisions. I think ultimately the key question around marriage is culture, and what do we value and what do we celebrate, and that's where I always go back to education on it.
And as much as we're hearing these days that folks can't find housing, young people aren't buying homes, I think it's up to like 70%, 71% of married couples own homes. And so you never hear that positive side of, married couples are doing well in terms of that indicator.
Yeah. But even I think with some of the cost of housing increasing, why you see, I think it's 20%, 21% of single people own a home.
Right.
That's a big gap. And naturally you would expect that a lot of them are renting or living in apartments and that kind of thing. But it does create that barrier of, I don't know if I can take that next step. I don't know if I can afford it. Because you hear those cultural narratives play out like, raising kids is so expensive.
That's what I'm saying. That's the argument, is because they don't have a home. If I have kids, I can't afford a home. Well, that's not what we're seeing in the data.
Well, and again, this is one of these things that, this is a grand philosophical point, but people do what they want to do. I know, right? That's really, really deep thinking. People do what they want to do. At the end of the day, take high school students, right? They are told the secret of happiness in life is going to college, right? And so they will take on massive amounts of debt to go get this college experience, right? Even if it's not even necessarily something that they're getting a degree that they want to do. They're not even so much going for that educational experience for what's next in some situation. They just need that college experience. And so they'll rack up monumental amounts of debt. So this is the one thing that makes me pause on the affordability issue. We do have a massive affordability problem in the housing industry. I'm actually more open to some of the bills you see going around that are dealing with. Some of them are like Chinese-backed companies. Some of them are just private equity companies that are going around buying single-family homes and making it, driving up prices in an artificial way. So all of that is very real. But I will just say, like, the question is, what do Americans value? And when we value the college experience and maybe going out and drinking and doing all that kind of, and we don't value getting married, having kids, finding fulfillment in these just fundamental joys of life, work, all of those types of things, we're less likely to go and purchase that house, right? And so, and when you do get married, all of a sudden that does impact. You see that impact the things that you value. So you're willing to go and take on that mortgage and then work hard to pay that mortgage and
positive incentives.
Exactly. Like, so this is the hardest thing about working as Christians in this public policy space is most people who jump into this space will just say, well, government always has a solution. There is a piece of legislation. There's a bill for us to lead with. And a lot of times there is, right? If they're transing kids, pass the bill to stop it, right? But sometimes with things like this, you got to change culture in order to actually deal with the broader public policy problem.
Another place that we're getting involved with what's become widely culturally accepted. We've talked about it here on the podcast before, the sports gambling issue, and we were part of a press conference yesterday. Aaron, you spoke. David, I know you were very involved in getting a couple of bills prepared for the legislature to consider, the Save Ohio Sports Act, and trying to deal with some of these most predatory aspects of the sports gaming industry.
Yeah, family, and this is one. We're in this for the long haul.
Yeah, buddy.
You talk about lobbyists and opposition. This one is going to be a major fight, and it already is a major fight. But we've got 4 amazing sponsors on these bills. 2 of them, the sports integrity bill. And then we also have the consumer protection side of things. But at the press conference, I mean, you have to lean in on this with us. Go to ccv.org/gambling. Mike and his team, mostly his team, put together some amazing resources. We got national experts on there. But you have to ramp up on your knowledge base here and your level of awareness. And that press conference should be the beginning of that. I think we should post that because we had – your mental health professionals, Dr. Toole. You had, Lawrence Funderburk there, former OSU and NBA star.
We got to get him on the podcast sometime because he played. I didn't realize he was teammates with Damon Jones, who was one of the former NBA players that was at the center of the Chauncey Billups, Terry Rozier gambling scandal. That was when he said that at the podium yesterday. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and he's big on financial literacy and, been involved for him and his wife probably 30 years on this issue. So he's a great resource, very articulate in this area. We had Brianne, come in. She's a national advocate for, kind of pushing back on the gambling industry. And so she brought some really good expertise there. Tony Coder came in from the Suicide Prevention Network. And just so many really strong.
His testimony was sobering.
Wow.
What he shared during that press conference, just of, how quick it is that a lot of folks, from the moment they decide, for folks who don't successfully complete a suicide attempt, it was like 60% of people who decide and make the attempt, it's within 5 minutes, and it's 70% are within an hour.
That's right. And with this mobile stuff, he said, I just don't have enough time to get to him.
Yeah.
Man, that froze the room.
When you're chasing losses all night on your cell phone in your dorm room or your apartment by yourself, Yeah,
and people don't, and that's what I'm saying. You gotta get ramped up on this knowledge base here, because it's not the win that develops the dopamine rush as much as it is the chase.
Yep.
Right. So even when they win, it's not enough.
Yep.
It's that the chase that produces the dopamine hit, and so many of all of the vices out there, the addictions out there, the gambling addiction has the highest rate of suicide by far.
And for the Christians who are listening, I think one of the most unique things about the gambling issue is how it touches on so many things that we should care about and so many things we talk about. It's a life issue, as we just mentioned with suicide. It's a family issue because of how many families break down over the financial stress that's caused by chasing the losses.
Yeah. Dr. Toole mentioned that the number one cause of divorce is not adultery; it's financial stress.
Mm-hmm.
And what more when you're chasing betting losses?
That's
right?
why the suicide occurs.
Yep.
It's because of the financial stress.
Yeah, so check out the resources. The one stat that came up yesterday in the press conference that blew me away was, 600 and some minors?
Yep.
We've got stats of 600 minors who have placed illegal bets in the state of Ohio to the tune of like $2.7 million or something like that. That's insane.
Well, and this is, and again, that's what we've caught. Right, it's the whole thing that
Caught.
That's the part of this that's always so over the top. And when they say, like, this is the as soon as this bill dropped, you saw the gambling industry freak out. Right, they lost their minds.
And look at all of the people carrying water for the sports gambling industry.
And I want to invite Bobby Carpenter or Clay Travis or any of these sports commentators to come on the podcast and come talk sports betting with us, guys. If you're so confident this is good, the difference between their podcast and our podcast are that we're not sponsored by the gaming industry, right? This is not brought to you by FanDuel or DraftKings or Bet365. But the reality with these guys is that they make these ridiculous arguments about how, oh, well, if we, all the same betting is going to happen, it's just going to now go over into Indiana or Michigan. Number one, cool, great. Let's not have that here. That's a net gain. But number two, no, it's not. Like, this will massively decrease if somebody can't sit while they're driving down the street and place a bet on their phone. And I saw somebody else say, oh, people are just going to get VPNs and do all this. Say what now? Like, half the 20-year-olds we interview at CCV can't, operate PowerPoint, right? Like, I mean, and my parents certainly can't set up a VPN, right? Like, what are we talking about? Like, they're gonna. All of a sudden, all these folks are going to become super tech literate and learn how to set up an illegal web system to be able to trick the cell phone companies to say that you're actually accessing the FanDuel and DraftKings from Michigan instead of Columbus. Like, what are we talking? It's just, they think we're stupid. That's really the reality of what they're doing.
Or they think that I'm not incriminating myself, but no one here has attempted to use a VPN to get around MLB's ridiculous blackout rules.
Who could ever have tried something like that?
Who would have done such a thing? Impossible.
Impossible for that to, and it doesn't work that easy, does it?
It does not. It is a serious...
What is a VPN?
Thank you, David, for
proving our point,
for making the point for all of us.
Elder generation has no idea.
Yeah, and honestly, it's and even too, like, again, when you talk about the minors, like, it's just common sense. As somebody who was once a 16-year-old in public school, how easy it would have been. We didn't have smartphones back then, but how easy it would have been to get my brother or sister to either just let me do this under their name or to just steal their ID and log into FanDuel or DraftKings on my phone and place bets there, either for myself or for my friends in school, which, again, we hear stories of these things happening. And so it's, again, what we're really doing with this, and folks can go onto the website to read the fact sheets about these. Like, the biggest thing that's sending the gaming industry into a tizzy is basically saying no mobile gaming. So all sports betting
on location.
Would be on location at one of the casinos in Ohio. I did have one guy reach out and say, hey, why are we not why are we still allowing for sports betting? Why are we regulating this terrible industry, not banning it? CCV I would love to get the casinos out of Ohio. The votes aren't there for that today. And so what we see this as something that's going to deal with probably 90% of the harm, and not, the lawmakers just 3 years ago, unfortunately legalized sports betting. And so we're not completely doing away with this, but we see this as a good compromise that's going to put Ohio out there as a leader on how to rein in an industry that's just ruining sports. We all can just agree that the betting ads just ruin the game experience, and even the questioning of was this a fair outcome, right?
And this is a big one. This is a big mountain to climb. But all of our national experts have said of all the states where they've traveled working on legislation, they are most encouraged by Ohio. Yeah.
We're going to have plenty more on these bills as they move through the process, so we'll keep you updated and try and get some more experts in to talk about this issue and really help you understand why it is so necessary to take action. We're going to take a quick break here, and then we're going to come back and talk with Mark David Hall. David, this is a conversation you and I had. It was a while ago now, in all honesty, just so you know how the sausage was made. We've had so many great interviews and opportunities pop up. We haven't been able to run this one, but Mark David Hall, great expert on America's founding and how Christianity was so integral to that. It was a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure it's going to be something that you can benefit from here in America's 250th anniversary year. So that's coming up next on The Narrative.
If you've got something to say, we want to help you say it. Hi, I'm Vince Tornero. Since 2018, Westler Media has been helping churches, organizations, and events amplify their message online. Thinking about starting a podcast, need help with social media or video? My team and I produce thousands of hours of audio and know how to create the content that will get the views, clicks, and shares that you are looking for. We just so happen to produce The Narrative too, by the way. So if you're interested or just want to ask questions, get in touch. WestlerMedia.com. That's WESSLER Media.com.
Pastors today are constantly pressured to stay out of politics, even as their congregations face confusing cultural issues that can only be navigated with solid biblical wisdom. Hi friends, Nick Spencer here, director of CCV's Tom Menery Fellowship for Cultural Engagement. The Tom Menery Fellowship helps pastors understand the times and shepherd their churches with foundational truths from Scripture. This program brings pastors together in regional cohorts where they gain biblical insight, practical guidance, and the confidence to speak wisely into today's unique challenges. Ohio pastors can join a community of leaders committed to courage, clarity, and connection. Learn more and apply today at MeneryFellowship.org or click the link in the show notes for more information.
And we're back on The Narrative. Mike Andrews, David Mahan, and we're joined now by Mark David Hall, who's a professor in Regent University's Robertson School of Government and a senior fellow at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy, an initiative of First Liberty Institute. He's also a distinguished scholar of Christianity and public life at George Fox University, and he's written a number of books on the topic of Christianity and politics in the American founding, and we're so grateful that you're giving us a few minutes today here. Mark, thanks for the time.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Well, as I said, when we reached out here celebrating 250 years since America's founding, there's a lot of conversations about the founders, how America got started, and we're just really seeking throughout the year to emphasize the fact that America's founders, even if they weren't all Christians, they were very solidly looking to the Bible and Christian ideals to start our nation. I'm curious, just in your work, have you seen an uptick in people like us that want more information on that as we sit here getting ready to celebrate 250 years of our country?
Yeah, no, I think so. I think in the mid-20th century, there was a pretty powerful scholarly consensus that most of America's founders were deists, that they created a godless constitution, and that they wanted to strictly separate church and state. And beginning in the 70s and 80s, some popular Christian authors began to challenge this narrative, and they made good arguments. I think they were mostly right. Unfortunately, sometimes they would not use evidence carefully. They would use quotations that couldn't be substantiated and that sort of thing. But then beginning in the 90s, you had a number of scholars, myself included, but others such as Daniel Dreisbach, Tommy Kidd, Jeffrey Morrison, Carl Richard, who brought more scholarly chops to this project. And I think we've documented pretty well that, in fact, these claims are highly inflated, that there's no good reason to think most of America's founders were deists. They certainly didn't want to create a godless constitution. And there's no real good historical argument that they desired the strict separation of church and state. And so I think we've made a lot of inroads, and some of our books have sold pretty well. The Did America Have a Christian Founding? Daniel Dreisbach's Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers are two that jump to mind that have sold really well for books written by academics, usually academic books. You know, if you look at my books on Roger Sherman or James Wilson, they maybe sell 800, 900 copies, whereas these books have sold in the tens of thousands, which is heartening to see.
What are some of the key passages that the founders looked at when writing our initial documents, whether it's the Declaration or the Constitution? I obviously have a few in mind, but since we've got an expert on it, would love for you to just tell our listeners what are some of those concrete passages we can look to, or sections of the Bible that were really influential in our founders' thinking.
You know, one I would highlight, actually multiple passages make this clear, is that humans are sinful. And even Christians continue to struggle with the old man within. And the founders, to a person, were convinced of this, right? So even in Madison and Federalist 51, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary. But, I'm paraphrasing, men aren't angels, so we need government. And not only that, but that we have to be really careful with political power. We want to ensure that political power is not concentrated, that the power of the national government is limited, that we have separation of powers, checks and balances, and that sort of thing. If you look over to Europe, Enlightenment political thought is going in kind of the opposite direction. Enlightenment thinkers, certainly members of the radical Enlightenment, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, think that humans are basically good and that we can reach a utopia if we only fix, say, the educational system, if we only have rules ruled by a educated elite, probably working out of a national capital. So we don't want decentralized power. We want centralized power in the hands of experts. And we've seen other manifestations of that sort of thing. Pretty much any utopian thinker believes that humans are perfectible. So Karl Marx, if we fix the economic system, everything will be fine. Plato, if we educate people properly and make sure philosophers rule, everything will be fine, everything will be perfect. America's founders were far from any of those positions.
You know, we operate in that intersection between church and state, right? And so here at CCV, we've got a large network of churches, and the secret sauce that we have is being able to take the issues that we're dealing with across the street at the State House, boil that down to where they can be understood, and then go to the body of Christ and say, will you help us advocate for these principles and these issues? Most of the time, we're welcome with open arms. Sometime, there's reservation. I'm sure you get that as well. I don't know how much speaking you do in churches, but do you often get that pushback of not necessarily separation of church and state, but just, this is really not a major role for the body of Christ to engage in this area?
Yeah, so I do a fair amount of speaking. Usually it's on college and university campuses or on think tanks or that sort of thing outside of churches. I do occasionally get invited to churches. I do think there are important questions that pastors should ask. What is the primary purpose of the church? And I think a good answer might be the proclamation of the gospel and the proper administration of the sacraments. And so they're somewhat careful when it comes to political matters. And I certainly understand why a pastor or ministerial team would decide not to specifically endorse candidates. But it seems to me that church leaders have every reason, that ministers of the gospel have every reason to speak to the important moral issues of the day, things like abortion, things like the mutilation of children, religious liberty. And I can think of no good reason why they wouldn't be talking about these issues from the pulpit. And I really appreciate the work you guys are doing. I think it's very, very important work.
Thank you. In that same light, how did the 18th century church deal with this, right? I know hindsight is 2020, and I know we'll talk about the 18th century church, and it was like, so amazing in how they dealt with some of these issues, or in terms of government.
Yeah.
But you never hear anything about the role of like like any kind of media or right, like nobody knows what's going on in the room except for the people that were in the room. In today's culture, the discussion is formed so much by either good or bad media coverage, and then everybody responds from there. But how did the 18th century church deal with the issue of government?
Yeah, so you probably have to be careful and go church by church, and some churches would be different than others, obviously, just like we have today. But I would say on balance, especially in churches coming out of the Reformed or the Calvinist tradition, which is probably about 75% of the churches in late 18th century colonial America, it would be incredibly common for ministers to preach on political issues. There's a wonderful collection edited by Ellis Sandoz called Political Sermons of the American Founding. It's a 2-volume work. Collectively, it's as big as 2 old-fashioned phone books, and he collects a wide range of sermons on a variety of topics. Sermons supporting the War for American Independence, sermons critical of slavery, sermons on the Constitution, whether it should be adopted and ratified or not. And of course, sometimes you have ministers that would differ on these matters. Anglican priests were more likely to oppose the war for American independence. They split about 50-50. On the other hand, these Calvinist clergy, Presbyterians and Congregationalists, were just about unified, just about 100% in favor of the war for American independence, and they didn't hesitate to preach that from the pulpits. And in states where you had established churches, oftentimes when the legislature convened, you would have a minister show up and preach to the combined lower house, upper house, and governor, an election sermon, and these would oftentimes be published at the expense of the legislature and distributed. And so far more people than happened to be in the room at the time would be able to see what these ministers are proclaiming.
Kind of along those lines, and maybe looking more at our current moment, there is this, I think, element of we are using the same vocabulary, but maybe not using the same dictionary in how we interpret the words that are being used, such as like religious liberty, separation of church and state. These are things that get thrown around, but from totally opposite sides. So how did the founders, generally understand religious freedom, and how does that conflict with where we're seeing that dichotomy in how those terms are used today?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on something that's very, very important. I would say there was a pretty robust consensus in the late 18th century that religious liberty must be robustly protected. And religious liberty, to get specific, certainly includes the freedom to believe whatever you want. So the state shouldn't go around trying to compel belief. It certainly involves worshiping according to the dictates of conscience. So are we going to baptize babies, or are we going to baptize adults? Are we going to have the Eucharist every Sunday or once a quarter, or not at all? These things should be left up to the churches. But beyond that, we also have a right to act upon our religious convictions whenever possible. That is, we have the right to do things outside of a church, a mosque, or synagogue. To jump to the present day, there weren't any mosque and only a handful of synagogues in late 18th century America. But it certainly involves our ability to act upon our religious convictions. So if I'm an evangelical and I believe I need to go door to door sharing my faith, I have a right to do that. That right is protected in the U.S. Constitution by the Free Exercise Clause. The very first part, or close to the first part of the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Note that language of exercise. I get to act upon my religious conviction. What I just mentioned would also be protected by freedom of speech, but I don't think we even need to go there. The Free Exercise Clause is sufficient to protect my ability to take my faith into the public square, to run my business according to my dictate, my religious conscience, right? So if I own a very large chain of stores called Hobby Lobby or Chick-fil-A, and I have a religious conviction that people ought not to work on Sunday, I'm certainly free not to open my stores on Sunday, and it would be inappropriate for the state to attempt to compel me to do so. So we can tease that out a little bit more if you'd like. Let me mention this. I think in the 21st century, to your point, you do see a shift among American progressives. Back in the late 20th century, they tended to support this robust understanding of religious liberty. In the 21st century, they're much more likely to talk about freedom of worship. So even political progressives are happy to let people do whatever they want in a mosque, in a synagogue, in a church. But if you want to run your business according to your religious convictions, like Jack Phillips, the cake baker in Colorado, and these convictions violate the sensibilities of political elites, we're going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. No, Jack Phillips, you can't decline to custom design a cake to celebrate a same-sex wedding. You have to do it, and if you don't do it, we'll drive you out of business. So we've seen a shift in the 21st century, unfortunately, among political progressives.
Yeah, and along those lines, there's almost an argument that's being made from the other side, and I could be generalizing here, but they see that any type of Christian moral formation or basis that we're attempting to bring into the public square is coercion. And yet, to your example about the Jack Phillips case, they are very clearly trying to coerce somebody to go along with their beliefs. So there's a strong disconnect there. And I'm wondering, was that even on the founders' radar, like that type of dissonance, or how did they strike that balance of, not violating that liberty or conscience that each person can bring their beliefs to the public square?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I would say it was front and center. The founders recognized that people should be free to act according to their religious convictions or not act as dictated by religious convictions. Let me give you a couple of clear examples of this. So there are tiny groups of Christians, Quakers, Amish, Mennonites, brethren, who believe that Jesus meant what he said when he says, "Swear not at all, but let your yea be yea and your nay be nay." Now, these folks got in a lot of trouble in England because they couldn't swear oaths. They couldn't swear loyalty oaths. They couldn't swear oaths to tell the truth in civil courts or criminal courts. And they were oftentimes thrown in jail because of their inability to swear an oath. Now, these individuals, these groups, do not mind affirming oaths. In their mind, Jesus is really being quite literal when he says, "Swear not at all." So we can't swear, but we can affirm. Fortunately, in America, almost right away, certainly by the mid-18th century, almost all colonies would permit Quakers and others to affirm rather than swear oaths. Think about the Constitution. The Constitution itself has 3 oath provisions, and in each of these instances, it's laid out that someone could swear or affirm the oath of office or whichever oath we're talking about. This is really innovative. We don't have this in England until about 1832. Similarly, these groups I just mentioned tend to be religious pacifists, again, taking Jesus quite literally when he says to love your enemy, turn the other cheek. And so these folks say we can't engage in violence. And do know, really, I think it's not our role to jump in and judge their interpretation, say, of Matthew chapter 5. Now, we can attempt to convince them otherwise, of course, but basically, if they read Matthew chapter 5 to require this, we should respect their convictions. And again, fortunately, colonies and the national government has said, okay, look, sometimes we're going to have to draft people, we're going to have to conscript people, and we're going to have all men sign up for a draft, for instance. But if you have a religious conviction that you ought not to use violence, we'll make an accommodation or an exception for you. We will permit you to do alternative service or something to this effect. So religion's not a get-out-of-duty free card, but it is something that needs to be respected whenever possible. And if we can accommodate, say, Quaker pacifists by letting them serve in a non-combatant capacity, we'll do that. Yeah, so the founders were very well aware of these sorts of the need for these sorts of protections, and they passed them at the state level and they passed them at the national level.
As we celebrate 250 years, so many folks want to paint the founding in their own image, right? Kind of looking back. I want, and this may not be a fair question, but have believers not be involved based on what right? Every civilization has a birth date and a death date, right? And based on what about those that started with a Christian foundation and those that did not, what would America look like had the Christian influence that was there in the founding not been there? What might we look like at this point, or would we make it to this point?
This is a great question. Over the last decade, there's been a number of books. Tom Holland's Dominion, Rodney Stark's The Victory of Reason, Larry Seidentop, The Invention of the Individual. And what these individuals, these authors argue is basically that Christianity has had a remarkable impact on the West. And it's led to a respect for human life. It's led to a respect for women as well as men, a respect for people of all colors, of people of all classes. And so Christianity has had an enormous impact, not just on America, but on the European countries. Now, these authors aren't quite as concerned about this as you or I might be, but it's kind of worrisome to think that when countries move away from the commitment to Christianity, as we're seeing in Europe, right? Europe is becoming post-Christian in many respects. We're starting to see a lot of worrisome things going on, right? People thrown in jail for praying in an abortion clinic, a Swedish pastor thrown in jail for preaching from the pulpit against homosexual activity. And so, yeah, all we have to do is look at the totalitarian and authoritarian regimes that rose up really throughout the globe, right? Communism in China, communism in the Soviet Union, fascism in parts of Europe, to see that really government can become really terrifying and really bloody really quickly. And so I think because of the Christian foundation of America, we've avoided a lot of that, right? We're certainly not error-free, and there's been wrongs done by the United States of America. Obviously, there has. But on balance, we've moved in a very good direction. Just to take one very common critique, the New York Times 1619 Project, that basically said all of America is informed by racism and chattel slavery. And really everything that makes America exceptional comes about because of this. Now, this is just utterly ridiculous. It absolutely ignores the enormous progress we've made on these fronts. So you can look at colonial America and say, yeah, this was inherently obviously unjust that some individuals owned other individuals, but then you have to look at the states that voluntarily abolished slavery. You have to look at Congress's act with respect to the Northwest Ordinance. You in Ohio never had slavery because Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance that said slavery will never be introduced into the old Northwest, into Ohio, into Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota. So that's a real world accomplishment that was made in the late 18th century. And then, of course, eventually we abolished slavery. And then eventually we abolished Jim Crow legislation at the state level, and then with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and so forth. So we haven't fixed the problem of racism in America. It's still a problem, but we've done a whole lot to ameliorate it. And I think almost all of that can be attributed to Christians who are engaged in the public square, who are fighting for justice and in righteousness, and are not afraid to do so at some risk to themselves even.
Hearing you rattle off that list, you can trace a lot of the good that has been done because of religion in the public square. I'm curious, in your mind, is there one narrative right now, or one of those zombie arguments that just won't go away, or it does go away and comes back, that you really wish we could just address, whether it's from the founding or from America's history, that's just wrong or maybe even harmful?
Yeah, so I would point to a broader problem, which is that the elite academy and universities in general, and especially schools of education, have largely been captured by political progressives. And they want to look at things much like the New York Times 1619 Project, although they might expand it. Some might want to focus on the oppression of women. Others might focus on the marginalization of people based on sexual orientation. Others based on racism. But it's just pervasive. And of course, then when people go off to be educated, they're taught this, and they go into the world and act upon what they're taught at universities, which is why I'm such a huge proponent of good, solid Christian universities and colleges. I think Christians have every reason to support these institutions, to go to them if possible. And even there, we have to be a little careful. I remember once at my former institution, George Fox University, we were putting together a Great Books Honors program, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for it, except in the School of Education. And they literally said things like, well, who's to say what a great book is? You like Shakespeare, I like Harry Potter, who's to say what's right? And one education professor even objected to the fact that it was going to be a Christ-centered honors program. And they said, well, what about students who aren't Christians? And this is at a Christian university. What about students who aren't Christians? Might they feel marginalized? Just a ridiculous objection, again, at a Christian university. So, yeah, I think we have a lot of work to do in the academy. Fortunately, Christians are making inroads into the academy. Almost every elite institution. I'm a politics guy, so I can point to solid Christian conservatives who are at the best schools we have at Princeton, at Harvard, at Yale, and yet they tend to be a tiny minority. It tends to be, 2 or 3 out of 50 individuals within the department, but we're making some progress.
Is there one particular founder that people are taking out of context that helps drive some of that in academia? Is there like one person that they just get wrong on what their beliefs were, or totally misinterpret what they were saying in order to fuel that move away from religion in America's founding?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm going to answer it slightly different than the question you asked. If you look at the books that argue that most of America's founders were deists, they all do the same thing. They look at the 4 founders that became president: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. And then they throw in a couple other founders, almost always Ben Franklin and an Alexander Hamilton. And then they attempt to read these individuals' religious views. In some cases, they have an accurate account. For instance, it is clearly the case that a Thomas Jefferson, a Ben Franklin, and a John Adams rejected elements of Orthodox Christianity. However, they also always throw George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton into that mix, and there's just no good argument. There's no good evidence that these folks are not Orthodox Christians. That is, there's no smoking gun like we have with the 3 founders I just mentioned, whereby they reject the divinity of Christ or the virgin birth or something like that. But then the real error comes in generalizing from these individuals to the entire founding generation. And if you think about it just for a minute, these are very unrepresentative individuals. Someone like a Ben Franklin spent half of the last 35 years of his life over in Europe. Thomas Jefferson spent a whole lot of time in Europe. So did Benjamin Franklin. These folks were educated in the ways of the Enlightenment in a way that most founders want. Now, there's nothing wrong with going to Europe. I love going to Europe, right? I'm not trying to blame Europe. I'm just trying to highlight that these are not representative founders. When we turn our eyes from these very important men who played an important role in the American founding, but they did not act alone. When we look at the broader population of individuals who attended the Constitutional Convention, for instance, when we look at the members of the First Federal Congress, when we look at members of the state legislatures or the state ratification conventions, basically evidence of heresy or deism almost completely disappears. And again, sometimes we just simply don't know about founders. That is a religious belief. We probably know if they're a member of a church or not, maybe if they're on the vestry or not. But a lot of founders just didn't leave a lot of evidence about their personal convictions with respect to religion. But that kind of cuts both ways, right? There's no reason to believe that they were not Orthodox Christians. And again, if you look at the broad political culture of the time, there's every reason to hypothesize that it's very likely that most political actors were in fact Christians who knew their scripture. Certainly, Daniel Dreisbach has shown this in spades in his book, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. The founders are alluding to Scripture, they're quoting Scripture, they're citing Scripture all the time, oftentimes without literal citations, because everyone knew the Bible, or at least all the political actors knew the Bible. And note a distinction I'm making here. I'm talking about what Donald Letts calls a political class. It is the sort of individuals that were voting, that served in state legislatures, that engaged in political debates. So I'm not talking about illiterate yeomen in Virginia or the enslaved population or Native American population, but the individuals who basically broke from Great Britain and created our constitutional order and who wrote new state constitutions. We have every reason to believe that they were Christians who were informed by their Christian convictions.
Yeah, it is the more polarized we get in America. I hear more and more from Christians, and really not just like left versus right, but Christians who may be on the same political spectrum. You've got two verses that they struggle with when we're talking about politics. You've got Romans 13, that basically says all authorities that exist are appointed by God. And then you've got Acts 5:29, that we must obey God rather than man. They'll usually throw those arguments back at each other as to how engaged the church should or should not be. What would where would you stand on that? How would you advise the body of Christ in relation to those two verses?
Well, first of all, I'd say in a representative democracy such as we live in, we have every right to attempt to bring about political change, right? If we don't like what the legislature of Ohio is doing, we can try to elect different legislators. If we think Ohio should have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, we can lobby our legislators and say, look, we should pass this, and here are all the reasons we should pass it. So I don't know of any plausible interpretation of Romans 13 that doesn't say we can't peacefully attempt to change the laws that we think are problematic or unjust. And certainly we look to, say, the abolitionist movement of the 18th century or the civil rights movement of the 20th century, and we say these folks are heroes. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Engaging in political action to end Jim Crow legislation. More power to him, right? This is great, honorable Christian political action. Now, you do get things become a bit more divisive when we think about rebellion, when we think about active resistance. And this is, of course, what the American patriots had to deal with in the imperial crisis beginning in 1764, 1765, when Parliament started acting in ways that the patriots considered to be unconstitutional and unjust, and when the Crown, instead of protecting the American citizens, started oppressing them, at least in the eyes of the patriots. And again, I think the way to think about this Christianly is you do not pick up your gun and start shooting people the minute you see an injustice. You try to change it. You engage in peaceful political activity. You send letters. You send remonstrances. You send protests. You have petition drives. You perhaps boycott. And this is exactly what the patriots did. Really, the controversy began, let's say, in 1775. It began in earnest in 1765. It's not until 1775, when the British Army sent troops to seize American arms, that shots were finally exchanged. And basically what the Patriots saw is that there had been a long train of abuses, and the Patriots had done a lot of peaceful things to try to end the abuses. Ultimately, these failed, and so there had to be active resistance to Great Britain. But that's a very high bar. So I'm sure there are laws in Ohio that you guys don't like, maybe even considered to be unjust, but you were not within a light year of being justified in overthrowing the government of Ohio, because we have so many peaceful remedies that we can use to attempt to fix these injustices.
Told you, Mike.
Hey, now you're going to spoil all my weekend fun. Well, Dr. Hall, as we get set to wrap here, if you could just offer, like, is there one thing that Christians should have in mind here, getting ready to celebrate 250th, whether it's in terms of that political engagement or America's history? If there's just kind of one summary statement you could make for our Christian believers out there to know we're on solid ground with the religious conviction or religious founding of our country, or our convictions to be involved politically, what would you say?
Yeah, I would say, there are obviously problems in America today, and our political discourse is disheartening, but we should count our blessings. We should be glad that we're Americans, that we live in a country founded on ideals articulated very well in the Declaration of Independence, right? That we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, some academics will say, all men, oh my goodness, that's horrible that only men are identified. Really, until the 1970s, men routinely was used to refer to both men and women. There's no question that the authors of the Declaration understood that all humans, men and women, white and black are endowed by their creator with rights. And America, you could think of America as being a long constitutional experiment in better protecting these principles. I've already mentioned ending slavery, ending Jim Crow legislation, granting women the right to vote, protecting equality in the workforce, and so forth. We are blessed. We are very, very blessed. And we still have work to do, obviously, but we should do that work, and we should do so in a humble, civil fashion. There's no reason to be engaging in violence in America at this point in order to bring about political change. There are so many peaceful ways that we can pursue justice. Christians should be intimately involved in that, and I think we're not doing our duty if we ignore the necessity of being engaged in politics.
Well, before we let you go, I want to give you the opportunity. Are there any ways that our audience, if they're intrigued by this topic, to get more information from the work that you've done or to follow what you're up to these days?
Yeah, thank you for that question. My wife put together a website, very easily found. It's markdavidhall.org, and it lists all my publications. My book, Did America Have a Christian Founding, engages in a lot of this material in the founding era. I have a second book, Proclaim Liberty Throughout All the Land, that really looks at how Christianity has advanced liberty and equality for all Americans from the early colonies to the present day. There are other things mentioned there, but those are the two books I would point your listeners to first.
Well, Mark David Hall, this has been a great conversation. We thank you so much for the time and for your work, and we're grateful to be able to host you today on The Narrative.
Thank you so much for the work you do, and thank you for hosting me.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Westler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.